History and coordinator of the Middle East Studies program at Grand Valley State University. Our speaker for this evening is Dr. Graeme Bannerman, a scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. As a Middle East expert, Dr. Bannerman is looked to for his insights on U.S.-Arab relations, regional security, and the Middle East peace process. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Graeme Bannerman for his presentation, The Arab Upheaval, Middle East Alignment. Dr. Bannerman.
When somebody stands up before me, I always kind of like to figure out who this guy is and where he comes from. So let me say something about myself, I might. I'm a Midwesterner. All 8 of my great-grandparents are buried someplace in the Midwest, as are my grandparents and my parents. I grew up in Evanston, Illinois. However, I have wanderlust. As a young person, I spent a couple summers in high school in Europe, and after graduating from high school, I spent the next summer traveling around, and I went to Egypt for the first time, and that was 1963. I went out and watched the Russians build the High Dam. I then spent a couple more summers traveling around, and then I was married the summer after college, and the day after my wife and I were married, we moved to Beirut. This is during the summer of 1967, just after the war. Her father was not pleased. We spent 3 terrific years in Beirut. I got a master's degree at AUB, taught there for 2 years, and then we came back and I got my doctorate at Madison. We then went to Washington, where I taught at Georgetown for a year and then joined the State Department. I spent 5 years at the State Department, where I worked on Arab-Israeli affairs. I had a terrifically good job. I wrote a daily analysis of Arab-Israeli affairs for the Secretary of State and the President 7 days a week. The good news is you got to tell the President every day. The bad news is you really didn't know your kids. I then left the State Department in 1979 after the peace treaty was signed between Egypt and Israel, and spent 8 years on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Those were days they never asked you your politics. They asked you, what do you know about your subject? They never said, what political party are you? I was the Middle East guy for 6 years, and then I became staff director for Senator Lugar for 2 years. Then, as politics happens in Washington, Senator Lugar lost the ranking position to Senator Helms of North Carolina, and Senator Helms gave me the opportunity to have another career. No one hired me. So I started my own business. For 20 years, I had my own consulting firm in Washington, where I worked with educational institutions in the Middle East, Robert College in Istanbul, International College Beirut, and Lebanese American University. But our largest clients were Middle Eastern and foreign governments. We worked with the government of the Philippines, El Salvador, Bangladesh. Our largest client was the government of Egypt for 17 years. We worked with the Palestinian Authority. We worked with the United Arab Emirates and the government of Lebanon. It was great, but I thought I was only going to do this for 3 to 5 years. So 5 years ago, I said, I really want to go out and do my own thing. So when I say that I'm at the Middle East Institute, that's one of my many hats. I have a life where I do exactly what I want. I have an office at the United States Institute of Peace, which is a terrific organization in Washington, and I also am on the boards of several NGOs that do good works in the Middle East and promote bipartisan foreign policy. When I had my job at the State Department, I asked the guy, why did you want me, some relatively junior guy, to write this memo? He said, because you look at the Middle East differently than anybody else. So I should give you fair warning. I look at the Middle East differently than other people do. Let me just start. What I would like to do is just take these few minutes I have here. I'd like to put in a historical trend of where we are in the Middle East right now and how it fits into the period of post-World War II. I don't think you can appreciate at what a crucial point we are for the interest of the United States as we are at this moment. When World War II came to an end, the prevailing philosophy that existed within the Arab world was Arab nationalism. Arab nationalism it began in the late 19th century. It was a way the Arabs began to identify themselves. They looked at the world and said, why are we behind the West? Why are we falling behind? And the answer was, we're not enough like them. So the Arab nationalists said, we're proud to be Arabs, but we need to adapt a Western philosophy. Now, the range of philosophies they adapted were anywhere from the communists and the socialists to the progressives to the liberals to the conservatives or the Ba'athis. They were all Western philosophy and orientation, and they were secular. They were secular in orientation. The Arab nationalists at the end of the World War II began to replace the governments that were created by the ruling colonial powers. in Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq, later in Libya, in Yemen. All of these countries had Arab nationalist governments. So when, in 1967, my wife and I arrived in Beirut, if you asked the average person, who are you? A simple question. They would say, we are Arabs. The majority, overwhelming majority would say we're Arabs. They were proud of that. This is what bound them together. This was an identity. The '67 war and the defeat and humiliation of the Arab armies began to erode the strength of the Arab nationalist. It was seen as a rejection of Arab nationalism. You failed us. You didn't do what was necessary. But there was always a second strain that existed in the political philosophy in the region. And that was those people in the region who were a traditional conservative point of view. The reason we are not doing well is not because we're not like them, it's because we've given up on our own values. And these were the fundamentalists. They looked to their own values. We first must be true to ourselves, and then we can face up to the others. So starting in 1967, you began a trend in the Middle East where people began to increasingly identify themselves not as Arabs first, but as Muslims first. So if you did a survey last year or 2 years ago in the Middle East, and you asked that same question, who are you? The overwhelming majority of people in the region would say, I'm a Muslim. Not that I'm an Arab, not that I'm... Two countries were exceptions to that. The two exceptions were Lebanon and Egypt. And in Lebanon and Egypt, the majority said, in Lebanon they said, we are Lebanese, and Egypt said we're Egyptians. The problem for the Lebanese, however, was they couldn't agree on what that meant. Each community thought being Lebanese was something different from the other community. But in Egypt, nationalism was very much there. So you have today in the region, everybody, no one should be surprised that if you have a free democratic election in any Arab country today, the Muslim parties are going to win because they reflect the majority of people. Now, is that bad? Is that good? It's neither. It's just what's going to happen. And they're also going to have a range of views that are Islamic. But that's there. We're at this point in the region. Now we've developed these more populist governments, and they're all going to be more Muslim. Egypt is particularly important, and I want to emphasize this. Why is Egypt important? Egypt is the only country in the region that has the ability to tip the balance of power one way or the other. What I mean, in the early 1950s, when President Nasser took over, Egypt wanted to reach out to us. We mishandled it. We dropped the ball. We couldn't adapt to the new Arab nationalism that he represented. When he asked for help on the high dam, we asked for weapons, we said, no, we're not going to give you those, and you have no choice, other options but us. Well, people always have other options. And he went to the Russians to build the high dam and to the Czechs to supply their weapons. And for the next 20 years, the region was tipped in favor of the Soviet Union. So when I was in Beirut, President Nasser could give a speech in Cairo and put 10,000 kids on the street demonstrating against the United States in Beirut. President Sadat changed that. President Sadat made a determination that the interest of Egypt would be better served by being with the United States. And he therefore made his move to make peace with Israel as a way to improve the relationship with the United States. And since that period of time, the Sadat period, the region has been tipped in favor of us for the last 35 years. But with the changes going on today, there is the potential, if we misplay our hand, as we did for the changes in the 1950s, that the region could tip against us. And that would be a serious problem for us, because we would lose our position of dominance. As I like to say, the British in 1956 lost their position of dominance in the region on the shore of the Suez Canal, and we have the potential of that today. So we need to play that very carefully. The other thing that's absolutely clear, every situation in the Middle East is different. Each country is different. There is no situation that can any answer to all those questions, and we have to be very, very cautious on how we do this. The other thing is absolutely clear. We have little or no idea what's going on in these countries. We tried the best we can, we do the best we can. If the really good people understand 30% of the situation, I'm talking about those of us who spent our whole career looking at these guys, we may know 30%. But they're playing on 7 different levels below us, and they're very different than we are. And you have to adjust to that. Now, is there any reason why we won't be successful? Absolutely, there's no reason why we shouldn't be successful. But will we be there? It's not clear. The other problem we have as a country, in the Middle East, there is a decline of American influence. I'm not one who says our period has passed. I don't believe that. But I do have to recognize that American influence in the region is fundamentally less today than it was 10 years ago. For 3 reasons. First, you have to look at, there's the military region. American wars in the region have been very unpopular. American popularity because of these wars is high. Let me put it this way. Congress has a greater approval rating in the United States than we do in the Middle East. To give you the depth of our problem. Therefore, we need to be careful of what we're going to do. Now, the military power of the United States is still feared and respected, but that doesn't mean they're happy with every way we use it. They see us not as liberators. They didn't welcome us in Iraq like some people thought they would by throwing roses at our incoming army. They looked at it differently. The military power is still important, but it's a dual-edged sword. Secondly, economically, it's hard to explain the damage done to the American image by 2007, 8, and 9, our economic crisis. The whole system of capitalism that we had promoted came into question because we created all sorts of economic instruments that brought economic chaos to the world. Our image in the economic sphere is extremely tarnished. It's going to take us a long time to work out of that. We used to be admired, looked up to, we want to be like the United States. No, they're not so sure about that anymore. We don't want that sort of thing to happen. And third, on the political scene. The United States has been the dominant political force in the region since Sadat said the United States has 99% of the cards during the peace process. Unfortunately, I think most of us have misinterpreted what he meant. He wasn't saying that the United States is more powerful, more influential, can do all these things, we're more wonderful, we have better ideas. No, he meant that in the main issue for the core Middle East area, the peace between Israel and the Arab states and the Palestinians, the United States was the only country that could influence the Israelis to make the concessions that were necessary for peace. That's why he turned to Camp David. That's why he went to Camp David, and it worked for him. And for the period from Sadat until the mid-90s, the United States was seen as a broker, a fair broker in the peace process. Because we were willing to disagree with the Israelis when we disagreed with them, and we were willing to disagree with the Arabs. In Washington, however, there was another thought process that came into the process. It's legitimate, it's real, and it's genuine. The Israelis are being asked to make huge concessions in this process. These are life and death questions for the Israelis, and therefore the only way they'll make those concessions is that they have to be reassured that they will not be deserted by the United States will not sacrifice their interests, they will protect them. Therefore, this line of argument went, we do not want to be different with the Israelis in public. So since the mid-90s, the United States policy has been, Democrats, Republicans, across the board, that we will not disagree with the Israelis in public on major issues. We'll obviously have difference with anybody on some issues, because it will only weaken the Israelis' resolve to make the necessary concessions for peace. The only problem with that argument is it hasn't worked. There has been no progress towards peace in the last 16, 17 years. None. And worse than that, from the perspective of the Arab negotiators, the Palestinians, if you sit down and talk to them, they said, when we were at Camp David, the Palestinians have said to me, the reason this failed because there were 2 Israeli delegations and us, because there was no disagreements between the Americans and the Israelis there. And the Palestinians always felt they were the odd man out. If you want to know why the Palestinians, and this is the most worrisome thing for us as Americans, went to the United Nations last September to begin the process of looking in the international community for support on the process, which we say broke the agreements, going out of the normal process of negotiated between Arabs and Israelis with the United States as the key factor. They were rejecting us as an impartial negotiator. And this was encouraged by most of the Arab states. Why? The old formula of Israelis and Palestinians, or Israelis and other Arabs negotiating with the United States as the arbitrator, was being rejected as totally failure. It wasn't working. We were never going to get peace. We were never going to get what happened. So on that issue, and as much as we like it or not, that issue still can touch the heart of Arabs. They don't talk about it all the time. They don't care about it all the time, but it is one issue that rallies them across the board. So where do we stand? We come up against this changing region. Any government that comes to power in the Arab world that reflects the people it's going to be much more difficult for us to deal with. I don't care if it's our friends the Egyptians or the Jordanians, the Syrians, the Libyans, or anybody. If the government truly reflects the views of the people, it's going to be more difficult for Americans to deal with. They look at the world in ways we don't. So therefore, we're going to have to adapt to how to deal with it. We don't have to agree with them. I don't think we should agree with them. But we have to understand where they're coming from. I like to say this. I've now been married close to 45 years. Yes, for the young people, people can be married for 45 years. My wife and I can have the most ferocious argument over Jefferson that you can imagine. We've had knockdown, drag-out battles over Thomas Jefferson. We argue over lots of things. But we come to conclusions, and we approach issues quite differently. And my wife has been kind enough never to say that I'm illogical. We look at the world differently. People in the Middle East look at the world differently. When I was teaching at the American University of Beirut, the Palestinians were striking on campus. AUB at that time, we had kids from 70 countries. It was all, the Lebanese were a minority on campus. It was really interesting campus to be on. We were having a strike on campus because these Palestinians and Israelis were fighting in South Lebanon, and they were striking to support the Palestinians fighting in South Lebanon. Now, here I am. I'm Mr. Simple Midwesterner, teaching a course at the university. So I speak to the Palestinians at the gate of the school. I said, I understand why you want your country. I'm sympathetic for your cause. But don't you think you would be more effective if you would go out, become doctors, become lawyers, become engineers? You'll be able to do much more for Palestine by doing that rather than striking. This kid looks at me and says, don't get logical with me. What he was saying to me was, don't try to apply your Western logic to our problems. And we're going to have to learn that they're not going to apply our Western logic to their problems, and we're going to have to find some way to deal with them. And it's not going to be easy. Listen, I've talked long enough. I think we'll go to questions.
Yep. Good. Thank you very much for those comments. And you talked a lot about Egypt and being the most important country in the Arab Middle East anyway, and its critical role and so forth. So perhaps you could say something about what you see happening there now. I've been reading lately about compromises being made with the Muslim Brotherhood and the military command and so on. So what is your take on what's happening?
Well, I'm very optimistic about Egypt as a country. I'm optimistic about Egypt because of Egyptians. Because Egyptians by nature are conservative, moderate, and work for consensus. It doesn't matter where you are. You cannot succeed in Egypt by being a radical. So therefore, whoever becomes to power, whether the Muslims or secularists or whoever they are, will be moderate. And those people who are characterized as radical will lose to the others. One of the reasons the liberals did so poorly in the elections is they appeared to be the radicals to the majority of Egyptian people. Because they continued to demonstrate, disrupt the economy, hurt tourism, do all these things, while the country was trying to get back on its feet. The Muslim Brotherhood could portray itself as moderate, and they won. With regard to the United States and Egypt, we really are at cross purposes in many ways. I mean, in the State Department in 1970s, when Sadat made his move to us, one of the things we did is we did a study, and we said, what is it that the Soviet Union did to sour its relationship with the Egyptians to get themselves tossed? And our study came to the one conclusion. The Soviets got too much into the Egyptian business. Egyptians are nationalists. They got down in the military to the battalion level with advisors. In the ministries, there were Egyptians. I mean, there were Soviets there advising them. The Egyptians said, we don't want these foreigners telling us what to do. So we set forward the policy at that time not to get too much into the Egyptian business. Well, the U.S. military has been terrifically good at not doing that. And so over the years, the U.S. military and the Egyptian military have learned to work together very well. On the civilian side, we have not done as well. And if you look at the recent crisis on the NGOs, it is a perfect example of how we have not handled it well. What we hear in the American press, and you hear from Americans, is the Egyptian government is a bunch of throwbacks. This Faiza Abu-Naga is a holdover from the old regime. They're out to undermine civil society, and they're doing all this because they're trying to thwart the revolution. That's the general argument you get in Washington. I mean, the Washington Post runs editorials about that, and so does the New York Times. And so if they do, that means we all know that's the truth. So what happened was, actually, in the Washington Post, and in fairness to the Washington Post, on Saturday, they ran an op-ed piece from Faiza Abu-Naga. Now, I have to tell you, I'm not a totally unbiased source here. When my wife and I were in Egypt in January, and we had a nice 2.5-hour lunch, just my wife and I and Faiza Abu-Naga, to discuss this issue. And it's always bad to be, by the way, to be at lunch with two women like that, because after about 3/4 through, they bonded against me, you know. And Faiza says to my wife, says, "Does he always talk politics?" And my wife says, "Only 95% of the time." So, but what happened was, we wanted the national. Please understand, I'm somebody who believes that American democracy is the best thing for the world, and I believe we should promote it. I have myself been an election observer. I was in the Marcos Aquino election observers. I was in Haiti. I was in Mongolia, in Yemen, all 3 Palestinian elections, Pakistan. I believe in it. I think we do good things supporting democracy, but we need to be culturally sensitive in addition. In the mid-2000s, NDI, the National Democratic Institute, and the Republican Institute came into Egypt. Now, the Egyptians were being pressured by us to let these people come in. You know, they didn't want Americans getting into their political business. They thought it was bad for Americans to be working with political parties in Egypt and doing things like that, because they don't trust us. They think we're trying to interfere in their affairs. So, but they handled it in a traditional Arab way. They didn't say, yes, you could come here, but they didn't say, get out either, because they knew that would irritate us. So they looked the other direction. And so both NDI and II came into Egypt, and they had a small office in Cairo funded through State Department funds, which is very limited. So they had like 3 or 4 people operating in Cairo, low profile, not going on. And there was a written agreement between us and the Egyptians that no money from the Egyptian aid program, which was significant, $250 million, or actually at that time it was $415 million. No money from the U.S. aid program to Egypt could be given to an unregistered NGO, and these guys were unregistered, and to be legal, you have to be registered. So they were operating outside the law. And you had to have joint projects approved by both governments, which seemed, that was all the agreed and established practice. By the way, when you're not registered, that means you can't have bank accounts. And if you're not registered, you can't get work permits. So what you end up doing is bringing money in to individuals rather than through bank accounts, another violation of the law. And you come to Egypt on a tourist visa and not a work visa, another violation of the law. So, I mean, so what happens is they really put themselves in jeopardy. So after the revolution, last February, the State Department made a unilateral decision, and the White House, it's not just the State Department, that you could use the economic support funds, that's the bilateral economic assistance funds, to support the NGOs even if they're not registered. So since last March, in the last year, they put $150 million into NGOs in Egypt. Some registered, some unregistered, which is 6 times the amount of money that went to NGOs in the previous 6 years. So the Egyptians all of a sudden said, whoa, what are they trying to do? They're trying to get into our business. NDI, IRI, and the Freedom House ended up opening up, instead of a small office in Cairo, opened up 17 offices all over the country. And the staff of IRI went from 5 to 75. This raised all sorts of concerns. And you have to understand, people in the Middle East don't believe that everything we do is altruistic. They are conspiratorial. They see all sorts of things going on here that's not happening. I always just say to my friends out there, I only wish the CIA were as good as you thought they were. I'd be really happy for the United States. But you know, but the thing is, so all of a sudden, this raised the red flag. It stayed, the Egyptian government tried to work it out with us behind the scenes, and then in June, we announced publicly that we'd given $40 million of the Egyptian economic aid, which was supposed to go to what they felt was to the Egyptian people, to these NGOs. We thought it was to promote democracy. It now was public. At that point, they initiated a judiciary procedure against, in Egypt, the judiciary does the investigation. They're the combination of the FBI and judiciary. And they went through the process, and it's been in the hands of the judiciary since last September. The raid in December 29th was part of the judicial procedures. It was not the executive branch. So what happens then? They raid the offices, they put a no travel on anybody who was accused of breaking the law, which we do, and it became this huge incident where everybody in Washington is saying, cutting aid, doing all this, we're going to press the Egyptians, we're going to make them do what they want. Now, there's certain countries in the world who view themselves not only as nations, but as civilizations. China, Iran, Egypt. If you view yourself as a civilization, not as a country, your reaction to foreign pressure is somewhat different. They weren't going to get pressured. In addition, we were saying to them, we said to the military, you guys who are the executive, interfere in the judiciary process to get our people out. And they said, that just proves what the judges said is true. They have an ulterior motive that isn't promoting the rule of law. So you've had this friction there. If we don't begin to let them do their own revolution, if we don't press them on this, I mean, if we don't help them work it out, because it's in neither of our interests to alienate them, we are going to see them turn away from us. And that worries me. That's bad. I mean, please, I'm not saying the Egyptians are reasonable on everything. They're not. They're Egyptians. They have their own attitudes, their own ideas, as we have our own. But we have to be at least somewhat sensitive. They're, by the way, extremely proud across the political spectrum of their revolution. We've had elections. We're working for the rule of law. We're limiting the power of the executive. We're going to change our constitution. We're doing all these things, and that's good. Now, the one other issue that's bad for us is we have idealized the demonstrators in the square, and we should. They are great young people. They are exactly like we are. They share our values. They've gone to our schools. They speak English. They're photogenic, and they are truly idealistic liberals. But they don't reflect more than 5 or 10% of the population. We have to deal with that other 90% that's out there, and it's not easy because they don't tell you every day what they actually think.
All right. Do you think, just following up with Egypt and other countries, Arab countries in the Middle East as well, do you think the developments here, like the election with the Muslim Brotherhood winning so many seats in Parliament and so forth, as far as U.S. policy is concerned, does this give us a more nuanced understanding of the region? Do you think policymakers in Washington of the complexities of the region, whereas before we tended perhaps to push the Islamists aside and
Yeah, I think you already see among the Americans a realization that the world is changing on them. and they're trying to adapt to it. I mean, it's impressive. I mean, to be honest, I had dinner with, my wife and I had dinner with the ambassador and the chief military guy in Cairo, and they are very sensitive to the changes. The Muslim Brotherhood has established a good relationship with the American embassy. When Senator McCain and Lindsey Graham and the others were in Cairo, they went and met with the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is now a regular stop on the American visitors. And by the way, American visitors to these countries are incessant. It's like a train, and everybody spends a lot of time talking to Americans because they really want to reach out to us. Not only that, it's the Salafis. This is the more right-wing Muslims have reached out to the embassy themselves, and they want to talk. We need to talk to them all, and we need to listen because they view the world very different than we do. But we need to find a way to communicate. It's not going to be easy, but we can do it. And I think we're making moves in that direction. But by the way, threats to cut off military aid, threats to do this, all this does is run the nationalistic right into the face of Egyptian nationalism, and they get very irritated.
Let me ask you a different part of the region, the role of Iran. We read a lot, we hear a lot about Iran, its influence in Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, Bahrain, and so forth. So is this real or is this imagined?
No, there's no question that the big benefactor of the American 2003 invasion of Iraq was Iran. American policy, I was on the policy planning staff at the time of, or just after the Iranian Revolution, and we were scrambling like crazy to try to figure out how to promote our interests. And I'll take full credit for being not lasting long in that job because I didn't do a very good job of it. No, because I disagreed with the policy. But anyhow, what happened was we saw Iran as the enemy, but the bulwark against Iran was Iraq. Saddam Hussein was a despicable, horrible human being, but he was an Arab nationalist secularist who opposed the Iranian force. And our fear at that time was this revolution in Iran, this Muslim fundamentalism, was going to spill over into the Arab world. But the bulwark against that was Iraq. And the Iraq-Iran war of the 1980s blunted the ability of the Iranian Revolution to get into the Arab world, with a few exceptions, Hezbollah and somewhat in Syria. But that was there, and that tipped the balance. When we forgot the message in 2003, and we saw Saddam Hussein only to be the thug that he was. Do not mistake anything. There's not much good you can say about Saddam Hussein. He was a thug. He was brutal. But he was a resistance to the spread of Iranian Islamicism. So when we knocked Saddam Hussein out of the box, 60% of the population of Iraq is Shia, naturally aligned with Iran. But you can overstate that. I mean, in 1980, I'll tell you, in the intelligence community in Washington, when the war began, the question in Washington that was debated, are the Shia in Iraq Shia first, or are they Arab first? And they turned out to be Arabs first at that time. But the experience of the United States and the Sunni-Shia conflicts in the civil war that followed in Iraq has managed to crystallize a very Shia identity among the majority in Iraq, which is much more sympathetic to Iran. It is no longer a bulwark. In fact, they facilitate the arming of the Syrians today by letting equipment go through. They let people go through. It is. So we've turned this large Arab state from being a bulwark against the Iranian to being an ally, or at least not an opponent of Iran.
Thanks. One last question has to do with the impact of the awakening on the Israeli-Palestinian situation, or crisis, or whatever we want to call that. What do you see happening there?
Well, in the short term, it takes the pressure off doing anything, because everybody's so self-consumed with their own problems. If you're a Syrian and you're fighting for your very existence against some other group of Syrians, you don't have time to worry about the Palestinians. If you're in Egypt and you're worrying about organizing yourself for how your future is going to be, you don't have a lot of time to worry about the Palestinians. In the long run, it's not that good, because the Palestinian cause touches the heartstrings of all Arabs. And therefore, when they think about it, the injustice just drives them crazy. And you're also going to see with the Egyptians a fundamental change on the treaty. Now, will the Egyptians continue to honor the peace treaty with Israel? Absolutely. It's in their interest to do so. But what they won't do is put up with some of the things the Israelis have done in the past. The perfect example was last summer when the terrorists got into Israel and killed the 8 Israelis. The Israelis stormed back across the Egyptian border and killed 6 Egyptian border guards on their side of the border, thinking that they were something they weren't. The Egyptians went wild. That's when they stormed the Israeli embassy in Cairo. It had to take them out. The Egyptian foreign ministry objected to it. They're not going to, in the old days, if something like that had happened, and there were incidents in the old days, Mubarak's people would have dampened it down. It would not have been in a newspaper. Nobody would know about it. That's not going to happen again. And so therefore, incidents like this will be much more difficult. So on a day-to-day basis, there's going to be more frictions. But the peace treaty will remain strong because it's in the interest of both countries.
I did said one last question, but I have one other. That is
one last question.
If you were giving advice to the Obama administration about what its policy should be, I mean, this is an election year, so that's an added issue. But what advice would you give to the administration as far as the Middle East is concerned, and the conditions and the awakening and all?
Tom Friedman and I sat on a panel together in Cairo when I was out there in January, and he said something which I agree with totally. At a certain point, the United States should just stand there. It's hard for Americans just to stand there. We always have to do something. We want to be helpful. We're like this large dog. We want to be helpful. We want to be good. We're friendly. But sometimes just stand there. Let them do this. This is their revolution. Stay out of it. Because, by the way, there'll always be people who are on the losing side in every one of these things that will call us, help us, because we're like you. And the great thing, the amazing thing is, people in the Middle East are tremendous salesmen. They know what we want to hear. And they will tell us, we are just like you, we agree with you in every single way if they want our help. Both sides will. The perfect example is in Lebanon, Bashir Gemayel was president-elect and a militia leader in the early 80s. And he would come to Washington, I'd sit there and close my eyes, and he'd say all this. He would say things like, as long as we Christians are here, the American flag will never leave Lebanon like it left Cambodia. And then I'm sitting here in recent years, Wally Jumblat, who was on the other team, would be there and says, we Druze are the best friends the United States have, and as long as we're here, the United States interests will be taken care of, because that's what people in Washington want to hear. We just have to be cautious to realize these guys give us a line. Ahmed Shalabi in Iraq went and spoke to the guys in Washington, the neoconservatives, and told us exactly, we are with you. We can overthrow Saddam Hussein. Everything will be good. They'll welcome you with rose petals. The people of Iraq will rise in favor of the United States. That's because he wanted to go back on an American tank. We just have to be more cautious and more skeptical about what people tell us. And look at what our interests are, our narrow interest, and stay with them.
Good. Well, this might be a good time to open it up to your questions. So if you'd like to come down to the microphones on either side and ask Dr. Bannerman a question. Anyone?
My name is Roland Ganney. I'm a professor at Grand Rapids Community College. And if I had occasion to spend time with you, I'd probably find myself in opposition to everything you said on a grand scale. And the reason being, I'm from Egypt. I was born in Egypt. I spent the first 22 years of my life as a third-generation European of the influx of Europeans that came into Egypt following the Khedive Ismail's invitation for the Europeans to modernize the country, as you probably know that whole history. But the sad part of it is you pointed out one thing I agreed with, and you left it pretty much in limbo. You said they identify themselves in the Middle East as Muslims. And frankly, that was a remarkable observation, but you left it pretty much in limbo because It is the underpinning aspect to which all consideration of life in the Muslim world is based on Islam. I know Islam as I know the back of my hand. I know it because I speak the language, I read the Quran, and to say that my friends, which are multiple Muslim friends, recognize what I do know. The problem I have with all the things you've shared, sir, is that I just gave a presentation at the Community College Conference in Traverse City, and I had the title, Arab Spring, and subtitled it, An American Delusion. Obviously, we don't seem to realize with our great optimism for democracy that you mentioned a moment ago, that it will not ever fit into the Arab or the Muslim mindset. It doesn't. The Muslim Brotherhood, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, was our neighbor in the Kuba Gardens area where I lived as a boy growing up. My father knew the gentleman, spoke with him. And he said to him categorically one day, because he was very friendly, he said, Mr. Ghani, we have an agenda. The world is going to be ruled by Islam. Take for what that means. I'm sure there are many Muslims who wouldn't even agree with him. He was assassinated by the king, King Farouk. I remember as a young boy reading about it. The sad part about our American presentation is that we always seem to forget the many issues you pointed out a moment ago are exactly on target. The temperament, they try to sell you something, the whole idea of how they seem to negotiate. You know, with all due respect, the whole idea of the single democracy in the Middle East is Israel, and yet we don't seem to remember that point. And the other countries are strictly basing their whole agendas based on what they can get from us. Yes, they have their own agendas, but Islam is the foundation of all that rules a Muslim majority country. I grew up in Egypt. I speak 5 different languages. I went to a British school. I have Muslim buddies to this day.
Do you have a question? Or
yeah, I appreciate that. And I apologize if I made a statement.
No.
But my question to you is, how can you reconcile that great dichotomy between what we call democracy and what you've experienced? Because I wouldn't even begin to touch on your huge exposure of what you've experienced. And in that sense, it's a remarkable example. How do you reconcile this seeming irreconcilable? You have great hopes for Egypt, and I was very happy you made that statement. But I don't see that. I know the land as I know my own heart. 22 years of my life. I apologize for my lengthy dissertation.
I think it's a good point. I think the point is, 2 points here.
Yeah.
One is that in the region, the minorities are deeply concerned. They're worried about what's going to happen in this. And you notice that if you go to countries like Syria or Lebanon or Egypt, they're very worried. Or Iraq. One of the great consequences of the American invasion of Iraq was the Christian population in Iraq has been reduced since 2003 from 1.5 million people to 0.5 million. It's been a catastrophe for the Christians in Iraq. But with regard to this idea, I don't think I ever said, I don't like the word Arab Spring. I use the word Arab Awakening. It's somewhat different. It's the second Arab Awakening. The second thing is, I don't think I ever used the word that I said there's going to be a democracy there. I never said that. What I said was there's going to be a more representative society. In the Middle East, it's very different than we are. Our form of democracy, we believe in confrontation. Bang, we fight ideas. Anybody who comes from Washington like I do, you fight ideas all the time. It is a battle of ideas. You wage against each other, you battle, and then you're supposed to make a compromise. We are not so good at that right now, but that's what we're supposed to be doing. In the Middle East, they will never do that. There's never going to be that. What they have to do is build a consensus. They do it through this god-awful process of talking and talking and talking, and then talking some more until it's kind of working together. And finally, they reach some sort of consensus they can live with each other. And the reason I'm optimistic about Egypt is you see it in the people, in the politicians. You see even the Muslim Brotherhood saying, though the liberals didn't do so well in the election, they have to be included in the process of making the Constitution. And those guys, the Salafis, who say, no, we're going to impose Islam, they're rejected because that is seen as radical. That's why I'm optimistic, is because of this nature of Egyptian society to work towards a consensus. Now, are we going to be happy with it? No. Is it going to be a Western-style democracy? No. But will it be Egyptian? Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm saying to you. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you. I never use the word Western-style democracy. I'm not one who believes in that, because they have to do it their own way. Society has to reflect their own values. You can't impose American values on these people, because they look at the United States, do you want to know the truth? And they say, we don't need that. We don't want to be like that. We don't like that. How do you like to go out to sell the efficiency of democracy and describe Washington today? How would you like to have to sell that one in the Middle East? It isn't. It's the way we do things. Therefore, they're going to have to do it their own way. It'll be less than what we want, but that's what we can't do. We can't. This is why we can't impose our values on them. They want their own values. We can encourage them, we can help them, and we can do that, but we can't make them do be things they're not. And we shouldn't even try, because it only works against us.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, you did specifically mention the Arab or the Egyptian attitude towards the IRI and the NDI as conspiratorial, and you painted a picture as these organizations went into Egypt and they broke a few minor laws, customary things, and that gave them reason to be greatly conspiratorial about the nature of their involvement inside of Egyptian democracy. But the International Republican Institute has been documented as actively overthrowing governments, as in countries like Haiti, where they trained Guy Philippe and his thugs across the Dominican border, went across, caused chaos, and the State Department went and kidnapped the president of Haiti. Like, so don't you think it's a little bit intellectually dishonest to call the attitudes in Egypt, which are completely logical and sound based on the IRI's previous history, conspiratorial in nature?
I mean, no, I can't comment on the Haiti. I have to tell you, my one experience in Haiti, I was an election observer there in November 1987. It was probably the worst day of my life. That was the day they killed 29 people and destroyed the elections, and the whole thing broke down. And so here I am. I'm a Republican who was a National Democratic Institute election observer, because they always take me along and say we're bipartisan. There are 29 of us in Graeme. Okay, okay. But anyhow, so I went there, and I was with this Venezuelan and a Filipino, because they were always multicultural. And we said, let's get a cab, because our cars didn't show up, and go down to the center of town. We went down to the center of town, and all of the ballot boxes were burnt. There were burnt ballots blowing around the street. There was nobody on the street. People had been killed. And all of a sudden, this other car comes up behind us with 4 guys in it, and they start shooting at us. And it was like a gangster movie, you know, like in the old Chicago 1930s. And we do about 4 blocks like this with this guy. Every turn, they're shooting at us. I'm fighting with the Venezuelan for the low spot on the back seat. That's what we're doing. It was a horrible experience. So therefore, I'm not one who will say that these guys aren't trying to do the good job. They are. I think if they did something like that, I'd be surprised. Because basically, the institutes, the Democratic Institute, the Republican Institute, they're trying to do a good job of promoting democracy. They have a tin ear sometimes. I agree with you. But what happens in the Middle East, people in the Middle East, like we do, make all sorts of conspiracies that happen. You know, it was amazing. You sit there. The Americans were doing X, Y, and Z, and the Americans were not having any idea that X, Y, and Z was going on. There's just enough going on for us that people believe we do more than we do.
That was the election after we forcibly removed Baby Doc Duvier, wasn't it?
Yes.
Okay.
Good, thank you.
Question. In Iran, right now, there seems to be a pretty good power struggle between the Supreme Council and Ahmadinejad. With that going on, how do we prevent a jihad between that country and the West over the nuclear situation, and with Israel possibly doing a preemptive? How do we prevent that holy war?
I was having a dinner with a very high government official and some congressmen for this NGO I was on, and he was defending the sanctions policy brilliantly, this high American official. And I asked him a question, and my question was this. I said, please look, on the question of Iran and non-proliferation, I don't have a very good record personally. I mean, I was on the policy planning staff for Iran in the spring of 1979. And there was a very famous amendment called the Pressler Amendment that affected our whole policy towards Pakistan. I'm the guy who wrote it. Okay, so I have a very checkered career. So I'm asking you a question, Dwight. I said, how do you know your sanctions are working? I said, what is the motive for the Iranians to get a nuclear weapon? What drives them? And he said, we're not really sure. I said, if you're not sure what drives them, how do you know your sanctions are making them change their mind? You have to know what they're doing. It seems to me the problem we face with Iran is across the political spectrum. It doesn't matter what happens internally. The overwhelming majority of Iranians believe their country should have a nuclear weapon. If you were sitting on the policy planning staff in Tehran today, and you looked at the world around you, and there's 3 countries in the region that have nuclear weapons that are outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty. What are they? India, Pakistan, and Israel. There is one country within missile range of all 3, and that's you. Then you look around the region and you look at the deployment of the world's only superpower, the United States, and they have forces on every one of your borders. How are you going to stop those guys? Then you look and you say, Libya gave up weapons of mass destruction, and what happened then? The West went after and destroyed the country. So why on earth would you not want a nuclear weapon? How can you guarantee your own protection? Until we, who believe it's bad for them to have a nuclear weapon, can address those concerns of Iran. By the way, and the ultimate, if you read the New York Times, every day in the New York Times, if you're in Tehran, they're talking about, is it going to be Israel or the United States that bombs you? It's not as if someone's going to do it. They're going to bomb you. Why on earth would you not be working like crazy to get a nuclear weapon to stop it? So therefore, we have a problem with Tehran. We believe, we the West and the Israelis, believe if Iran gets it, it'll be destabilizing to the world. And the Iranians believe if they don't get it, they're going to be overrun and crushed by these other people. And that as a proof. How do you bridge that gap? And does our policy bridge that gap? And I would argue it doesn't. In fact, if anything, we keep driving them. Their job is perfect. Their policy is absolutely clear. We want to delay and obfuscate and just keep pushing them back long enough for us to get the weapon. Because once we get that weapon, then they can't go after us. The other thing is, and one of the things you can't talk about in Washington, you cannot use the word containment, because containment means you let them have a weapon, and you can't use the word that the Iranians are rational. Because if you say they're rational, that means they could be one with a weapon and you can reach a regime with them having a nuclear weapon. So therefore, the minute General Dempsey, the head chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said Iran was a rational actor, the whole world jumped on his throat because once you do that, that changes the whole policy we have. Our policy towards Iran is either leading to war or Iran getting the weapon. And I don't see how we avoid that. That's not what I want. It's not what I think is a good policy, but I can't see how you get there with the current policy. And one more last point. I worked hard as anyone to keep Pakistan from getting a nuclear weapon. I thought Pakistan having it was much more worrisome actually than I do Iran. I was on the policy planning staff when we cut off aid to them over the nuclear weapon in 1979. Our assessment of the intelligence community in 1979 was they would have the weapon within 2 or 3 years. It took them almost 20, but they got it. We delayed them, we slowed them, we did the whole thing, but they got it because the country had a consensus. India had the weapon, the nuclear weapon, therefore we have to have it for our own security. The Iranians are in that position.
Just the quick follow-up, the power struggle between the two factions, the Supreme Council and Ahmadinejad, they seem to be butting heads. Can you just speak a little bit to that?
I can't, actually, I mean, I am not well enough aware of the, you know, I read the newspapers like everybody else, but I have no real insights into what's better there.
Are there any other questions?
Oh, I can't let it go by. So if you see the inevitabilities as war with Iran or Iran getting the weapon in the current situation, which would you rather see?
No, I am one who believes a military attack in Iran will have consequences that none of us can imagine. I mean, just look, they don't have to blockade the Straits of Hormuz. They need to put one of those missiles that Hezbollah has, that Iran gave, into one oil tanker going through the Straits. And that would shoot oil prices up. We're already paying 30 to 50 cents a gallon Iran premium because of the insecurity on gasoline. If you put a missile into one oil tanker, it'd be worse. There'd be terrorist raids like we can't believe. The Iranians are not people who will roll over quietly. And therefore, I think we better, I'm saying, I find this difficult. You have to understand, I came from a household of conservative Republicans. I'm so old that as a 7-year-old, I passed out literature for Robert Taft because Eisenhower was too liberal. Okay. Okay. In the presidential primary in '52. Okay. Anyhow, I'm Cook County, so it doesn't really matter anyhow. But anyhow, it is inconceivable to me that we go to war so easily these days. I mean, I think we have damaged the constitutional process in the last decade on war that I worry to death about. I'm one who wrote op-eds against the war in Libya on the grounds that, one, you really should have congressional approval. 2, you should have congressional funding. Because how are you ever, if you can spend $2 billion without Congress ever appropriating a dollar, how are you ever going to get a budget in line? And 3, I object to the idea that we're going to go to war for American values rather than American citizens' lives or national interests, particularly when only the executive branch decides when we get the war. That means they're deciding what our values are. That's not something we should be doing. We should be very cautious about these things. And finally, you know, it seems to me that if the idea, and this has become established in Washington now, General Dempsey testified this week before the Armed Services Committee, and he said, before we can go to war in Syria, which is the popular game right now in Washington, we have to have a legal basis. And the legal basis is, and this is the scary part, Congress has to act. That's scary, but it's not as scary as the second part. Or we need a UN Security Council resolution. So now we can go to war if the United Nations Security Council approves a resolution rather than the American people. It is, I mean, we have pressed this. This has moved over the last 10 years appreciably. And I'm not some, you know, I'm one who knows the faults of Congress as much as anybody. I've worked with those guys for a long time. But they still are the representatives of the people. And my basic line is you can't promote democracy abroad and undermine it at home. What? I think what it's a question of delay them, slow them down. I think the cyber attacks on them is terrific. I would, you know, I'm even not opposed to the Israelis assassinating their nuclear engineers. I said the Israelis. I didn't say us. Okay. Yeah, they've done that, by the way. There literally is a war going on between Iran and Israel already. It's a clandestine war. It's happening. It's going on. I'm not anything we can do to slow them down, but we must not fool ourselves to think that we're ever going to stop them, because they see it as their national interest.
We had a question texted in from the audience, and actually I think you just addressed it. So this question was asking about Leon Panetta's saying the legal basis to go to war. So you were, I think you just addressed that concern. So I'm just going to mention that we have your op-eds on our Facebook page if anybody wants to be able to take a look at those op-eds you wrote on Libya and I think on Egypt. So I don't have a question after all. I'll let Polly.
I guess I'm interested to hear more about your response to this gentleman's assertion about there's some sort of antithetical nature or antithetical relationship between democracy and Islam, because I think that's what he was suggesting, and I find that to be problematic. I mean, I've lived in a country that's democratic and Islamic and West Africa, and I think that there are plenty of Islamic people who practice democracy in India. And so I don't want the audience to be left with an idea that maybe there's something that doesn't work between democracy and Islam. Can you talk to that a little bit?
No, what I said is I don't believe that any of these countries will have a democracy that reflects us.
Right.
Because
No, I
ours is our
agree.
own. What they have to do is work out a system of government where the people can have their voice into the system in their own way. That's what I'm saying. Is we make a mistake because when we say democracy, all of us as Americans picture what we have. But that's not necessarily the best system for other people. I mean, what happens is in societies that are divided by communities and the like, and you have clashes tend to become violent, communal, and that doesn't do any good for anybody. Therefore, they need to use this consensus system. It's ijma in your case. They need consensus. You need to be able to do those things because they work it out. Now, how they do in West Africa, each country will be different. There is nothing says in Islam that the people should not be represented. There's nothing there that says that. They don't believe that. It's one of the great things about the West. You understand at the end of World War II when the British and French divvied up the region, every country where the French Republic occupied said the Arabs' natural inclination was to have a republic. And every country the British monarchy occupied, they said that Arab nature was to have a monarchy. They have to do their own thing. That's all I'm saying, is we have to let them do it. We want to encourage them to have more representation. We want them to encourage to do all of these things, but we can't tell them what to do. That's all I'm saying.
Right. That's fine. I just think that he said that they're fundamentally Islamic countries and there's something fundamentally different about Islam. And anyway, never mind. I understand your perspective. Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
What about John McCain saying we should go ahead and have a military operation against Syria or to help promote the overthrow of the Bashir government in Syria? How do you feel about that?
It's getting to the point where Senator McCain hasn't found a war he didn't like.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Touching on Panetta a little bit, but more specific to your op-ed about Libya. In there, you talk about how the intervention in Libya is almost in some way sufficient or necessary for the Russian and Chinese veto in the Security Council. I'm just kind of wondering how that functions.
Okay.
And the other side question there is, how is the United States having veto power in the Security Council not a de facto check that the United States government has control over?
No, of course it is. I mean, that's why the veto is. The 5 permanent members have veto power, so each one has de facto control to prevent it from happening. What I said about the experience last March on the resolution on Syria, which was designed to protect the civilian population, the Russians and the Chinese went along with it. What we did is we changed used that resolution not for protecting the civilian civilian population, but to promote regime change. We actively became involved on one side in a civil war and destroyed the army of the Libyan government. So the Chinese and Russians said, we're not going to vote for any more resolutions if you abuse them from just protecting the civilian population. And in fact, they say that very clearly. If you listen to what the foreign minister of Russia says, we're not going to do this again. It's not going to happen because we're not going to have another Libya.
That didn't have anything to do with Russia having massive military bases inside of Syria like we do in Bahrain.
And other places. I mean, you don't limit it to Bahrain.
I mean, Bahrain's specific case because we stepped down and didn't focus on them when the rest of the Arab Spring's going on because of Saudi influence and our military influence on the island.
Bahrain's a totally different issue, but let me just say something. I don't think the Chinese don't have any bases in Syria, and the Russians are against the idea that outside forces should interfere in the internal affairs for regime change. Period, at this point. I mean, by the way, most Arab states, excluding Doha and Riyadh, do not want to see outside military force getting into Syria. It's just, there's a strong engine in Doha and Riyadh, and they'll pick up a few others of the Gulf states because they support each other. But, you go to Cairo, do you want to get involved? Do you think, no way. We don't certainly want the United States changing another Arab government.
Okay. Amy, do you have a question?
This was text in from the audience. It might be really quite quick, and I think it was the follow-up to the question about Congress. Should Obama face impeachment for the assertion that the U.S. does not need congressional approval?
That would be an interesting question, but I think that anybody who believes in democracy believes, there's an election in the fall, and how that goes out. answers that question. You don't need to go to impeachment here.
You want to ask a question?
Mine's really for confirmation. I'm assuming I misunderstood you. You believed that supporting Saddam Hussein was a good call because it stopped the spread of Iranian Islam. Was that your opinion, or was that you stating the opinion of another?
I was saying that in the 1980s, at the time of the Iraq-Iran war, the United States was faced with a terrible dilemma. By the way, that Iran, which was this revolutionary wave that was spreading, there was fears that it would be everywhere in the Middle East at that time. The war starts between Iraq and Iran. You have a choice at that point. Do you support Iraq, or you let these revolutionary forces overrun Iraq and then spread throughout the region? We came to the conclusion, we, the United States government, across the board, that you needed to make sure that Iraq did not collapse, because that was in the interest. It was the bulwark against this fundamentalist Shia Islam.
And that's so much worse than the Kurdish genocide.
The Kurdish genocide, as you call it, which there is this, the issue up in the villages along the border occurred after that. That kind of later.
I'm aware, but he had it in his fundamentals. It was on his 5-year plan, if you will. It was in his
I
game
have
plan.
no idea what his 5-year plan was. You may know more than I do in there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay. Sure.
Assume Iran gets the bomb. Given the rhetoric, what do you think the possibility of them using it against Israel is?
Well, that's the fear. I mean, that has to be the legitimate fear.
That's a driving force.
That absolutely, that's why the question of whether or not Iran is a rational actor is completely important. If you think Iran is an irrational actor and would bomb Israel, which would annihilate Iran as a country, then you have to be very fearful. But if you think, on the other hand, that the Iranians are not going to destroy their own country for the sake of the Palestinians, besides you killed all the Palestinians that were there too. I mean, that is the issue. That is the real issue. If you are, as most Israelis are, who believe Iran is an irrational actor, their position is totally logical. I don't believe that a country is governed by people who are irrational. We have to understand what their rationale is. We have to understand what drives them, and then we can deal with them. They don't think the way I do. They don't think the way you do. But if we don't understand them, we can't even begin to develop a policy towards them. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Bannerman, thank you very much for providing us with such an insightful analysis of the challenges and possibilities involved in Middle East realignment. And thank you, Dr. Good, for moderating this session for us. Let's give him another hand. That was wonderful.